I don't remember that. It was alive. Though he so there is the
Good evening. It's good to see everyone here tonight. Tonight, as you can see, our topic is Hasn't Science Disproved God? And our speaker, Todd Chandler, I won't try to quote all of his qualifications to you. He is a professor at Florida College, and I know he's eminently qualified to speak on the subject because he was educated at the University of Florida. But more important than that, I know he would say that his background in the scriptures and as a man of faith certainly makes him qualified to speak on this topic. So please give him your attention tonight as he speaks to us. Come on up.
Good evening. It is a pleasure to be with you this evening. My wife, Jeannie, is with me. When we first got married, we lived in Gainesville. That's where we went to school. And we knew Jared. And he was little Jared at the time, little Jared. So it's been a long time. We also knew Sharon. And I don't think I've seen Sharon since we moved, which was in 1999. We moved away from there. So it's been a while. That's what part of the blessing of being a Christian, isn't it? After so much time, you go back, and there's such a connection there. Gene and I had the pleasure of worshiping with Gary and Jan Kaufman down in Tampa, and they worshiped here, I know, for a number of years, and the difference they make in our congregation is just evident. It's just evident, and I know it was here as well. So they didn't ask me to say hello, but I'm going to say hello from them to you all. They speak very fondly of this congregation when they have the opportunity to do so. So interesting title, Hasn't Science Disproved God? My job is, I'm a biology professor. It's what I do, is I teach biology. And in the world of natural science, there's a lot of talk about God. We don't need God anymore. Hasn't science disproved that? And really what that claim reveals that science believes we know so much, we understand so much, that we don't need God in the explanation at all anymore. That's how much we know. We are that advanced in our knowledge. There's a hubris in that's tremendous in that kind of a claim anyway. But that's what's behind it. So we're going to look briefly at this question tonight. Obviously, it's an extensive question, the whole realm of science. I'm going to talk about the niche where, the corner of the sandbox where I play most of the time, which is biology. We'll make reference maybe to a little physics or chemistry, but that's really not my thing. So we're going to talk about the connection between God and science. We'll start with what's the foundation of that? What's the foundation of belief in God, or Christianity specifically? And what's the foundation of science? Well, in history of science, there was no competition or some kind of war between science and God. In fact, they got along very well together. In fact, the argument can be made, and there's a philosopher of science named Stephen Meyer who makes this argument in a book he wrote called Return of the God Hypothesis, that the reason science as we know it today arose in Europe, predominantly Western Europe, instead of other varied cultures that had the potential to do the very same thing, in Asia or in the Americas, or historically even in the historical Rome or Greece or Egypt. Why did modern science as we know it arise in Europe? He makes the case it's because of a belief in God, in fact. And you can make the case. For early scientists certainly had a strong belief in God. If you all remember your chemistry, there's something called Boyle's Law. And it's a famous gas law where he relates pressure and volume and temperature together. Robert Boyle, very much a believer in God. We ought, whenever we speak of God and of his attributes, to stand in great awe. And he wrote a lot about his belief in God and how his study, in fact, of science was motivated by that, not in any way opposed to it. Michael Faraday, another name that comes up in chemistry. The book of nature which we have to read is written by the finger of God. There was no competition or antagonism between science and God as science was really taking off in what we know of the science today. James Joule, you run across Joules in physics a lot, chemistry as well sometimes. After the knowledge of and obedience to the will of God, the next aim must be to know something of his attributes of wisdom, power, and goodness as evidenced by his handiwork. So he studied nature to see in nature the attributes of God. More on that in a moment. That clearly reveals a belief in God. That pursuit had issues with it. And we'll see that in this lesson tonight. And actually led to some potential problems, but you'll see. The point now is historically, scientists and belief in God were hand in hand and were complementary of each other, not antagonistic at all. And if you like your milk or orange juice pasteurized, you know Louis Pasteur, the father of microbiology. The more I study nature, the more I stand amazed at the work of the Creator. Louis Pasteur, a French microbiologist. And on we could go with that. We're not going to, but on and on go. We could go with the history of science. So compare that with what I was introduced by my professor at the Noble University of Florida. I took a class called the Human History and Evolution. It was all about the early presumed humans, all the fossils and stuff. Lucy, that sounds familiar, the Lucy fossils, some of those kind of things. And the first class started this way. She said, and this is a great professor, by the way, one of the best college teachers I ever had. She was outstanding in her field, highly published, National Geographic, led the U.S. team to Egypt to study the tombs of King Tut, really regarded in her field. And this is how she introduced us to science. She says, science is this. It's empirical evidence and continual testing. And then you have things like belief. And those are based on faith and doctrine. And so she set up this dichotomy, particularly the young students in here, the younger folks in here tonight. If your teacher or professor were to do this, your baloney detector needs to start dinging. You need a baloney detector, and it should start ringing. And something you should look at this and think, that just looks a little off to me. And because what she did is set up this dichotomy that lets science have all evidence and all testing, and no belief, no faith, no doctrine. That's not involved in science at all. Folks, that is absolutely false. Nowhere is that more evident than in the theory of evolution in biology. And it means if you believe in something, that belief exists apart from things like testing or evidence. And that's also, it should be false for a Christian, certainly. So, in other words, this science tells us what is reality. Your belief system is myth, it's superstition, whatever it is. We're not going to talk about that in class. We're going to talk about something else in this class. And so the foundation of the course was God and science are opposed to each other, and they live in different worlds. And that's just not the case, and you'll see it tonight. It's very much not the case even in the language of biologists. So here we are. Has science disproved God? Is that true? Well, that's a lot of words. Get to that. Show a slide like that, and the audience says, we all have a foundation of something. Everybody does. Every discipline does. And that comes, and everyone acknowledges that another famous physicist, Max Planck, made that clear in this quote, which I'll give to you. This is a bad PowerPoint slide. You're not supposed to fill them with this many words, but if I'm going to show you a quote, I got to do it. So here it is. No phrase has ever engendered more misunderstanding and confusion in the world of scholars than the expression, science without presuppositions. It was coined originally by Theodore Mommsen. It was meant to express that scientific analysis and research must steer clear of every preconceived opinion. Right? That's the aim. But it could not be, nor was it, intended to mean that scientific research needs no presuppositions at all. Scientific thought must link itself to something. The big question is, where? A lot of words. Here's his point. You can claim to be objective all you want as a scientist, but you are tethered to something. There's some kind of preconceived idea that you believe in that is untestable by science, but you believe it in anyway. You've got to link yourself to something. So what is it? Where are you linked? And he was honest enough to say that. Of course you're linked to something. And we're going to see what that is in a second. This is a quote by a man named Richard Lewontin. He was a Harvard evolutionary biologist. Huge name in the field of evolutionary biology. And he had this quote, and it reveals what Planck said we got to find. Where are we linked? And in natural science, this is what natural science is linked to. And he's very honest about this when he says it this way. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, some of the ideas it builds, In spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. What he's saying is, yes, science doesn't have a perfect record. It makes promises that never come to fruition. A lot of its ideas are called just so stories. That's a reference, by the way, to Rudyard Kipling, most famous for writing The Jungle Book. He wrote a set of stories. They're great kid stories, and they're called just so stories. They're full of made-up words. It's things like how the camel got its hump, how the elephant got its trunk. Some of you may be familiar with those stories. They're really fun. But they're just so. At the end of the story, and how did it happen? Well, it happened just so. It's this great imaginative tale. And what he's saying is some of science is like that. We come up with this story, and for now at least, it's a just so story. It's imaginative. If you think hard enough the right way, you can see how it might be true, but we can't really say with confidence that is true. And the reason we put up with that is because science is committed to something, and is committed to materialism. Materialism is the belief that all that exists is stuff, is matter, material. There's nothing supernatural. Now, you can't test for that. Right? There's no way to test scientifically if materialism is true. But that is the foundation of modern science. And that's important to understand. Science that claims to disprove God stands on a foundation of a belief system that cannot be tested, that nature is all there is. He goes on to say, it is not that the methods and institutions of science somehow compel us to accept a material explanation of the phenomenal world, but on the contrary, we are forced by our a priori, that means at the beginning, before it begins, our a priori adherence to material causes to create an apparatus of investigation and a set of concepts that produce material explanations, no matter how counterintuitive, no matter how mystifying to the uninitiated. Here's his point. Before we ever start science, we have a commitment to materialism. We are going to find a material cause, no matter how ridiculous it is, no matter how much we have to stretch our imagination to believe it, we are going to find a material explanation. Well, folks, if that's how you begin, of course you push God out of it, because you decided he's out of it from the very beginning. Moreover, that materialism, Lewontin says, is absolute. And why is it absolute? We cannot allow a divine foot in the door. The eminent Kant scholar Louis Beck used to say that anyone who could believe in God could believe in anything. To appeal to an omnipotent deity is to allow that at any moment the regularities of nature may be ruptured, that miracles may happen. Indeed, miracles like perhaps a resurrection. And if a resurrection is possible, well, there's big implications to that, right? Then maybe this whole idea of Christ is a real thing, and we can't have that. So that's the foundation of science. The foundation of science is belief in materialism. The foundation for Christianity is at least allowing the possibility that something supernatural exists. And if I allow the possibility, then I may find God in my investigation of what is true and what is not. For time's sake, I'm going to skip by the next couple of slides. So we're just going to skip over that chart and move along and those scriptures related to it. The fact is, the faith in God that the Bible calls us to have is not a blind faith. It is faith based in reason and based in evidence. Here's just a snippet of some passages that reveal this kind of an idea. 1 Peter chapter 3 and verse 15, sanctify the Lord God in your hearts, and always be ready to give a defense for everyone who asks you a reason for the hope that is in you, with meekness and in fear. Why do you believe in Jesus? Well, there's a reason for that. He said you need to be able to give that. Acts chapter 17 and verse 17, Paul had gone to Athens. He saw all the idols. And you remember that scene in Athens? One of my favorite chapters, actually, the way Paul managed that scene. And he says, I've got to talk to these people. I can't wait for Timothy and the others to get here. I'm going to start preaching. And so he starts preaching. He says, man, I see you guys are really religious people. Remember all that? Like, yeah, we are. He said, you have an altar to this unknown God. Yeah, we do. I'm going to tell you about him. And he preaches this great sermon there. In the middle of that chapter, therefore he reasoned in the synagogue with the Jews and with the Gentile worshipers, and in the marketplace daily with those who happen to be there. Paul never said, come and believe in Jesus Christ because I'm just telling you need to. He reasoned with them, and there was evidence to back it up. See the same thing in chapter 18 and verse 4. And he reasoned in the synagogue every Sabbath. Verse 19, and he came to Ephesus and left them there, but he himself entered the synagogue and reasoned with the Jews. And on. We can continue going through some of those passages you see on the screen. John ends his gospel this way in chapter 20 and verse 30. And truly Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these are written that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. John said, I wrote these miracles in here for a reason, so that you could reason through them. And this is still, of course, in the time period where many witnesses of these miracles were all around. So they could be investigated. I wrote this so that you may believe. I gave you reasons to believe. That's how the Bible teaches us to develop our faith. All right, so science and belief in God both have a foundation. Science is materialism. For Christianity properly developed, it is evidence that Jesus is the Christ. That's who we stand. We stand on the faith of an empty tomb. That's where we stand. So I'd like to talk to you a little bit about an element of science that I'm almost certain is going to be a new idea to most everybody. It was to me. So about a year and a half ago. In some of my study, I had a chance to sort of dig into this a little bit, and I discovered this idea, and it was really cool. That sounds nerdy, I know, but it was really cool as a biologist and a student of Scripture. There's a lot of theology in biology, particularly in the evidence for evolution. Science does not, even today, fully divorce itself from God. In fact, sometimes it builds its key arguments very much on a theological belief, and it comes out in the language. There was a movement in biology called natural theology. It was very popular in the 17th and 18th centuries, and you can hear the language. We saw it in one of those quotes earlier. I study nature to find God's wisdom, his beauty, and his goodness. Natural theology meant you study nature, natural, to learn about God, theology, the study of God. And we can find them that way. And natural theologians looked for evidence in nature of God's wisdom and his benevolence, his desire to make people happy, his grace. And that's how they interpreted nature, his beauty, and those kinds of things. But that had problems to it. Because I'm a biologist. You don't look very far in nature before you see things that are pretty savage, and they're ugly, and they're kind of repulsive. And everybody can see that. Well, how do you handle that as a believer in God? They also taught the idea of special creation, that all organisms were created by God exactly as they are, best suited for their place as we see them today. Well, there's also problems with that idea, because we've known for thousands of years that populations of organisms change over time. I don't know how many of you hunt. I'm not a hunter, but I know this. Deer in Florida are tiny. Deer up north, a man's deer. You can live off of those. Got to kill a lot of them down here. Did God specially create deer in Florida as we see them today? And deer in Ohio as we see them today? Or did deer on this continent, as they spread, those populations came to change? Because it's better to be bigger up north, and it's better to be small down south. And so the small ones do better, and over time, all the deer are small. And up north, the big ones do better, and all the deer. That's what happened. And we see that. We can chart that. It happens all the time. So natural theology was very popular, but it also had these two problems with it. Charles Darwin studied natural theology. Studied a lot, actually. And when Charles Darwin went on his world circumnavigating the globe, he saw these errors with it. He said, there's a lot of things in the world that are beautiful. There's a lot of ugly things. In fact, to him, there's a lot of things that seem to be useless or designed badly, in fact. And so if a good designer designed that, it wouldn't look like that. And he had tragedy in his own family, as many people did then. He lost a sister, he lost a daughter, and those hit him very hard, and He said, the world is not beautiful. The world is not full of grace. It's full of hard things. And that's at least many hard things. And that affected him on that. Well, Darwin picked up a book one day called On Limbs. Students, how would you like to get a book like that? The title is all about appendages, arms and legs and flippers and wings and stuff. Exciting reading. There's a summer reading project for you. Well, this guy wrote a whole book on it. And you see this kind of chart in every biology textbook in the world, basically. And what he said is, look at this. On the far left, your far left, you have a human arm. There's one bone up top, 2 bones in the forearm, some wrist bones, and 5 digits. Well, the one next to it is a horse. Look at the top. You have 1 bone up top, 2, some kind of wrist bones, and then the rest. I don't know what you got there. Number 3, I don't remember what that is. I think that's a wing, maybe. That's a bird's wing. And they got a whale flipper there at the end. You see the point. You see a pattern in all of those. And the suggestion was, well, that's evidence of evolutionary descent. That's the argument. They all descended from each other. And this is how Richard Owen described that. Why he decided it must be evolution. It must be an evolutionary thing. His assumption was God wouldn't do that. If God were to create limbs, he would create each limb unique. He wouldn't create a human limb with 1 set of bones and use that same bone pattern to create birds or equine or whales. He would come up with something fresh every time. And so because God wouldn't do it this way, clearly God didn't do it. That was his argument. And Darwin read that, and that heavily influenced Darwin. And in fact, Darwin makes the same case in his book over and over in Origin of Species. You see Darwin say, we see things this way. God wouldn't do it that way. That's where God comes into biology, including today. That argument is really common. We see things this way. No designer would do it that way. God wouldn't do it that way. Had he done it, he would have done it this way. Therefore, God didn't do it. The point is, they're bringing traits of God into the study of science to make science look better and to look stronger. Philosopher of science commented on this. He studied Owen and he studied Darwin a lot. He makes this observation. What matters is that Owen utilized the claims above as part of his case against special creation. These claims included, first, that a God who is free to create as he wishes would create new biological limbs de novo, that means from the beginning every time, rather than from a pre-existing pattern. Second, God must create biological structures like limbs in accord with a human conception of the simplest mode to accomplish the respective functions of these structures. The point is that Owen imposed his view of God on his study of the nature and said God wouldn't do it that way. Therefore, God didn't do it. That's theology. That's taking my idea of who God is and what he would do, deciding what he would do, and when it's different than that, deciding God didn't do it. And Darwin relied heavily on those kinds of arguments. Stephen Dilley, the philosopher of scientist who made the previous quote, said this as well. When Darwin invoked Owen to attack special creation, he implicitly relied upon this same line of reasoning. Epistemologically, Darwin needed these theological claims in order to use Owen's argument effectively in crippling special creation. Remove the theology from Darwin's argument, and little substance remains. You think Darwin removed God, our need for God? Not at all. Darwin needs God for his argument to make any sense. At least he needs his version of God for his argument to make sense. And when I learned that a year and a half ago, that so much in Origin of Species just opened up. It's like you shine the light on it. Like, man, there's God all over the place. And it's all over my textbooks. God's all over the place. And the strategy is a common one. To take an opposing view and make it look unreasonable. And that makes my view look more reasonable. Not because my view has actually more strength behind it, but the alternative looks weak. So if I say, look, God did this or nature did it on its own, Well, if I can make the idea that God did it look weaker and weaker, then by contrast, how does my view look? It looks stronger and stronger. And so evolution looks stronger the weaker you can make God look. The problem is, to make God look weak, they have to bring God into it, their idea of God into it. And this happens over and over. I'm going to share a series of quotes by people you've probably never heard of, but they're really big in science. So nerdy people know these names, some of them. Theodosius Dobzhansky, there's a name for you. Name your next kid that. He wrote an article, actually for teachers, back in the 60s, and this was the title of it: Nothing in Biology Makes Sense Except in Light of Evolution. If any of you kids in here are in biology, probably somewhere in the introductory paragraph, you'll see this quote. It's in almost every section of the evolutionary chapters of a biology book. They quote this: nothing makes sense except light and evolution of evolution. And he wrote this whole article on it. And it's almost become like a bumper sticker mantra for biology. But here's the issue with that whole article. This is also written by the same philosopher, Stephen Dilly. Strikingly, all 7 of Dobzhansky's arguments hinge upon claims about God's nature, God's actions, purposes, or duties. In fact, without God talk, the geneticist's arguments for evolution are logically invalid. In short, theology is essential to Dobzhansky's arguments. Take God out of the argument, and the argument just crumbles away, Dilly argues. And I think he's right. Stephen Jay Gould was a Harvard paleontologist, studied fossils, big name in evolution, wrote all kinds of stuff back in the 70s and 80s and in the 90s. He's been dead a while. This is what he said. He's talking about flowers. Orchids manufacture their intricate devices from the common components of ordinary flowers, parts usually fitted for very different functions. If God had designed, here, you see the theology there? If God had designed a beautiful machine to reflect his wisdom and power, surely he would not have used a collection of parts generally fashioned for other purposes. So he doesn't think God would make orchids the way they are if God had made them. You want to look at wisdom? You don't find it in orchids. You find it, well, I think I have this. Yes, I do. Orchids were not made by an ideal engineer. They're jury-rigged from a limited set of available components. Thus, they must have evolved from ordinary flowers. You notice how quickly Gould can go from some kind of religious premise about what God would or should have done to something that sounds like a scientific conclusion. You hear that? The last sentence is a scientific conclusion. They must have evolved. Every sentence before there is theological. Took a theological position on God. At the end makes what sounds like a scientific conclusion, and it's not. It's a theological conclusion. It's his belief in God and what God would or should have done that brought him to that conclusion, not the science behind it. Richard Dawkins, if you study much at all about evolution, Dawkins probably comes up. He's written a ton on it. He wrote a book a few years ago called The God Delusion. That's how bad he thinks it is to believe in God. It's delusional. Any engineer would naturally assume that the photocells, talk about the human eye, and that the human eye is designed wrong. Any engineer would naturally assume that the photocells would point towards the light. That is, the cells that in our eyes that receive light should face forward. They don't. They face backwards. With their wires leading backwards towards the brain, he would laugh at any suggestion that the photocells might point away from the light. Well, that might make sense. Maybe intuitively, I might think it would be wise for the photocells in our eyes to face forward. That's where the light's coming from. But in our eyes, they don't. They face the back. And the wiring that connects into the brain runs in front of that. So light has to get in front of all the wiring, get through the back of the cells, and then it hits the light-sensitive spot. Dawkins says no designer would have done that. We can discuss whether that's a bad design or not. That's a whole other lesson. It's a really cool study, actually. But there's reasons to think that's not a bad design, actually. There's benefits to it. But you see the theology in it. For time's sake, let me clip on along. Jerry Coyne, who is, I believe, a physicist? Maybe not. I don't know. Anyway, our focus instead is on genomic features that define notions of a supreme intelligence underlying biological design. Genomic flaws should, in principle, provide a more decisive test of whether unconscious evolutionary processes or cognitive agents, an intelligence, have shaped our genes. It's the same argument. Genetics wouldn't look the way it does if God had done it. One more quote. This is from my textbook. I use this every fall. I use this textbook. It goes through examples of things that are allegedly poorly designed in nature. And here's the theology in my biology textbook. Such examples of poor design illustrate that natural selection is like a tinkerer working with whatever material is available to craft a workable solution, rather than like an engineer who can design and build the best possible structure for a given task. Workable, but imperfect structures, such as the vertebrate eye, are an expected outcome of evolution by natural selection. It's the same argument over and over and over. Since Owen wrote his book on limbs, since Darwin wrote Origin of Species, since the geneticists of the mid-1900s to those today. It's the same argument. God wouldn't do things the way we see them, therefore he didn't do them. Biology is loaded with theology. It simply is all over the place. If God could not have created the world, materialism is the alternative. And so, has science disproved God? Well, no. They have not disproved God. They have used their conception of what God would or should have done to try to diminish our view that he actually did what we see today. There are a few lessons to draw from this, from the whole idea of natural theology. The first is, if I impose characteristics on God that he has not revealed about himself, I almost certainly impose something untrue. What those biologists were doing in the 1700s and 1800s when they were saying, let's study nature to see God's wisdom, was good. Except God never said everything in creation looks wise, or looks gracious, or looks benevolent. In fact, creation has changed. Ever since Genesis 3, right? Creation is different. It became hard. It became ruled by death. All kinds of bad things exist. And when we miss that, and we impose something on God that he has not revealed about himself, we set ourselves up and other people up to have their faith weakened. And that's what happened to Charles Darwin. He was set up in many ways by those who tried to defend God, but used poor argument to do so, to decide those arguments aren't right. God must not be the answer to all of this. If beauty, order, and happiness are evidence of God, well then suffering, pain, and destruction must be evidence against God. And those things are simply everywhere. And we know that. So Paley's argument was a bad one. I didn't mention Paley earlier. He was a natural theologian, maybe the best known one. Second lesson. I am simply not to analyze God to try to justify or explain him. He doesn't need me to do that, and he won't tolerate it. We see that at the end of the book of Job. As Job questions and questions and questions, at the end, God basically says, I am God and you're not. You may not, I don't have to justify myself to you. And then finally, God himself states that his own creation lacks wisdom. Turn with me quickly to the book of Job, if you will. There's an interesting passage here as God speaks to Job at the end. There in Job chapter 39. And Job is asking, of course, why? And look at what God says here in verse 13, beginning of Job 39 and verse 13. The wings of the ostrich wave proudly, but are her wings and pinions like the kindly stork's? For she leaves her eggs on the ground and warms them in the dust. She forgets that a foot may crush them, or that a wild beast may break them. She treats her young harshly, as though they were not hers. Her labor is in vain, without concern. Because God deprived her of wisdom and did not endow her with understanding. When she lifts herself on high, she scorns the horse and its rider, and on he goes, talking about the ostrich. Here's his point, I think. Job, look around you. Look at the ostrich. It may look like God didn't give her any wisdom. Look how she takes care of her eggs. Just lays on the ground. They're out in the open. Things can happen to them. That doesn't look wise. I don't care what it looks like to you. I created the ostrich. And you may not think it's wise. You may not get it. You may not understand it. But I created her. Now you trust me. That's his point to Job. So when I look at nature as a biologist and think, I don't get that. That doesn't make sense. God, I don't have to try to justify God being behind that. It could well be I'm just ignorant. That has happened more times than I can tell you in biology. The whole idea that most of our DNA is just junk, leftover evolutionary waste. That's what I was taught at the little school up the road in Gainesville. That is patently wrong. And we know that now. It is true that most of our DNA doesn't do what we thought it did. We were just 95% ignorant. That was the problem. Not that it didn't do anything. And science is full of those kinds of stories. Has science disproved God? Not at all. Not at all. We need to be careful how we speak of God when we study creation, that we don't make of God something he hasn't made of himself. That's exactly what has happened in biology. People impose their idea of God. Let's close with just a couple more. I know just have a handful of minutes, so I'm going to skip through a couple of these slides about the nature of God and such. I'll get to this. Is this correct? This is where we started. Is that really how science works? Science has nothing to do with faith? But not at all. And just that handful of quotes we've gone through, it's a lot of words we went through, a lot of quotes tonight, but it reveals there's faith all over biology, and nowhere probably more than evolutionary biology, including their faith in what they think God is, or would be, or would do. No, science has not disproved God, not by a long, long shot. Christianity and science work together very, very well when we do them both right. We need humility in both our study of God through his word and our study of God through his world and his creation. With that humility, we can find him in both. Nature, after all, is, of course, part of God's revelation. I'm sure Buddy read these passages a couple of weeks ago, however long he was here, not too long ago. The heavens declare the glory of God, and the firmament shows his handiwork. Day unto day utters speech, night unto night reveals knowledge. Creation speaks to us. So I say this, kids and younger folks in the audience, don't be afraid of science. We need Christians who study it and are good at it. We need to do that. But go into that, if you like science, think it's fun and interesting and cool, great, I do too. But go into that connected to people who can help you keep your faith. Because science is going to, in some cases, try to shake it off of you. But you can endure it. We should work together. And the more we understand the foundation worldview that science is tethered to, the more we're able to withstand. And it tries to push us one way or the other. And in the end, we know this. Whatever we think about the origin of the world that we study, it is this. It is by faith we understand the worlds were framed by the word of God. The things which were seen were not made of things which are visible. That's where we stand. Ultimately on faith. Whatever our position is, it is a position of faith. Now, do I offer the invitation now, or we have a break and the invitation comes later? Thank you. This is about the third time I've done one of these summer series, and they all do it differently. Trying to remember what did Jody tell me to do here? Well, believing God is one of the fundamental questions all people have to come to address. Do I believe in God or do I not? And it's a big question. And in a world that teaches materialism, and theories based on materialism, then there's a lot of messages about it is ridiculous to believe in it. But if you believe in God, if you're here tonight, there's some part of you that at least has that open, maybe a lot of you that has that open, then his revelation is just there to be seen. We don't have to discover it. He has revealed it. We don't have to go to some mystic mountaintop. It's right here for us. And there may be someone here tonight who has had that revelation, and you've seen it. Not only do you believe God exists, but you believe God came in the flesh. He became a man, Jesus Christ. And he walked, and he lived, and he was crucified, and he was a dead man put in a tomb. And by the power of God, he rose out of that tomb. Never happened before. And he ascended to heaven, and he right now sits reigning on the throne in heaven. He doesn't need our justification. But if you believe in him, before we leave, we want to give you the opportunity to make your allegiance to him. The whole world changes when we do. And by his grace, he washed our sins away, and begins to grow us into who he wants us to be, which is a person more like him. If you're ready to make that decision tonight, the brother of this congregation would love to help do that by immersing you in water baptism as you confess your faith in him. If you're ready to do that, please make your way from wherever you're sitting to the front as we stand and sing together.